That let's assume, for example, that a country is, for various reasons, threatening to withdraw from the Andean community. In these cases, for example, it is preferable to resolve a case breaching these deadlines.
Sometimes rules are made to be broken.
Yeah. The Andean community has in fact survived different political ideologies, such as import substitution, typical in the 70s, and has adopted a more open trade stance.
When having worked in the Andean community, does this really happen? Do you seek to borrow from Europe certain ideas and adapt them?
Actually, from my point of view, the main issue here is Bolivia. Well, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but
well, you do seem to have a very realistic point of view.
Yes, I think we will see continued fragmentation indeed. I don't see a scenario of greater convergence, to be honest. Having said that, it is difficult to predict this scenario with Trump. In other words, the WTO is going to keep functioning without a second instance, which means that Latin American countries are looking at, other ways to resolve their differences.
How do you view China's influence? Welcome to New Regional Orders, a podcast by the Center for Regional Integration. I'm your host and the Center's founding director, Ivo Ganchev. On today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Humberto Zuñiga Schroder, Dean of the School of Law at Universidad del Pacífico in Peru. Humberto is also the former head of the Legal Affairs Division of the General Secretariat of Comunidad Andina, or in English, the Andean Community. He is also a non-practicing solicitor of the Supreme Court of Queensland, Australia. Humberto is the author of numerous publications on international trade law and regional integration, including his notable book, Harmonization, Equivalence, and Mutual Recognition of Standards in WTO Law. Our conversation explores Humberto's career trajectory from academia to high-level practice in regional organizations, the resilience and limitations of the Andean community, and its relations with MERCOSUR. We also cover topics such as the rise and impact of global powers, including the US and China, the crisis in the WTO's dispute settlement system, as well as the implications of all of these developments for regional integration in Latin America. I hope that you'll enjoy this engaging discussion. If you do, don't forget to like the video and to subscribe to my YouTube channel or to your favorite podcasting platform. Now let's roll the intro and get started. Welcome to the show.
Ivo Ganchev, Beijing-based academic, executive, and a consultant.
I wanted to try a theory on you.
Mira, esa es una pregunta para un examen de grado.
Go to the communities and listen to people,
Exploring change across the borders. Welcome to New Regional Orders.
Humberto, welcome to the show, and thanks for hosting us today at the beautiful Universidad del Pacífico in Lima.
Thanks, Ivo. A pleasure.
Now, let's start by talking a little bit about your career. You're an expert in international trade law, and you've previously served as an official in the legal service of the General Secretariat of the Andean Community, also known as CAN. Now, what led you to work at this regional organization, and what were some of the most significant experiences and challenges that you encountered there?
Yeah. Well, my LLM and PhD were focused on international trade law. Because of this, upon finishing my doctorate in 2009 and shortly before returning to Peru, I was told about an open position to work as a lawyer in the Andean Community General Secretariat. I applied for said position, and after being admitted, I was in charge of the commercial area. It is important to mention that the legal area of the General Secretariat of the Andean Community is made up of one director and 4 lawyers, one for each member country. Now, experiences and challenges. Well, my previous work experience was in the Peruvian Anti-Dumping and Subsidies Commission, and we never dealt with the formalities that are typical in an international organization, among them the sort of room for negotiation that a member country may have. It is definitely different working for your government from doing so in an international organization.
Well, that's a really fascinating first-hand insight that you have at working at the Andean community, but you're also an academic. So let's try to talk a little bit about bridging theory and practice. Now, many experts that are guests on this podcast, and myself included, are academics. We are observers of regional integration, but we haven't really worked within the field as practitioners. Before you started to work in the field of regional integration, what was your understanding of the process and of regional organizations? And were there some misconceptions that you had about the Andean community? And how did these change after you began to work there as a practitioner?
Yeah, sure. I wouldn't say that I had misconceptions, but lack of professional experience. My understanding of regional integration was mostly academic. For example, I dealt with free movement of goods in my thesis, but mostly from a European perspective, never in the Latin American context, let alone in real life. Having said that, dealing with these issues in the framework of negotiations with member countries and within procedures such as the preliminary phase of what we call the non-compliance action, and in cases of restrictions and levies, was quite unique. Now, regarding your second question, how my work in Cannes shaped my understanding of regional integration, well, it did it in many ways. Just to give you an example, within the Andean community, we are subject to regulations which establish specific deadlines to resolve, for example, a case of restrictions and levies. Obviously, as lawyers, we know that these deadlines must be respected, given that doing the opposite could affect said investigations. Having said that, let's assume, for example, that a country is, for various reasons, threatening to withdraw from the Andean community because of differences in specific policies. In these cases, for example, it is preferable to resolve a case breaching these deadlines in order to carry out parallel negotiations with that country so that it does not leave the institution. That is to say, in some scenarios, the desire to keep the four countries within the institution must take precedence over resolving a dispute within the deadlines provided for in the regulation. I don't know if this makes sense.
It makes sense, indeed. And, there is a saying, at least when I worked in business, that sometimes rules are made to be broken, in the sense that, if you ever want to achieve something that's sort of beyond the framework that you've established, you have to sort of go beyond the deadlines or the procedures in order to move things forward.
Exactly, for the greater good, yes.
Yeah, indeed. Now, you've also had experience as a university professor, so that's another sort of part of your work that can be linked to regional integration as well.
Yeah.
Now, when you think of universities, professors, and education perhaps in general, and regional integration, what do you think is the relationship between these two? Do you believe that universities do play a role or should play a role in regional integration, whether in the Andes or more broadly in general? Or if so, what does this role look like? Can it be effective? How effective can it be? And so on.
Yeah. Well, in some universities, yes. It depends on the focus of the university itself. Pacific University, for example, is focused on forming lawyers with a deep understanding of economics and businesses, which means that many students are not really into international issues. They are more interested in working perhaps in a law firm or in companies. Having said that, there are some students interested in these areas, hence why we have a mandatory course in international trade law and a regional integration course, which is elective, and which is taught once a year.
That's excellent, and I think that this is a great way to contribute towards the process of regional integration here. Now, let's focus a little bit more specifically on the Andean community. Some scholars in the literature have emphasized its achievements and its milestones, such as the achievement of a free trade area, more recently the Andean passport that's issued, I guess, jointly by all of the countries. And also some guests on the podcast have praised the resilience of the Andean community in the sense that unlike other regional organizations here that come and go or shift their, I guess, role and significance with the changes in the ideologies of governments, CAN remains resilient and continues to function over many decades. From your perspective, how would you assess CAN from a legal economic perspective or otherwise? How successful do you believe it is? And what metrics do you use to determine whether an organization like this is successful or no?
Yeah. Well, there is one person, Octavio Segovia, who emphasized the resilience of the Andean community despite shifting political ideologies, and I agree with him. Well, actually, despite some important setbacks in its more than 50 years of existence, for example, the withdrawal of Chile and Venezuela, the Andean community has in fact survived different political ideologies, such as import substitution, typical in the 70s, and has adopted a more open trade stance. I cannot tell you right now any metrics or benchmarks to evaluate its success. However, it is not a secret that the growth of CAN's gross domestic product in 2022 was more than 5%, whereas in that same year we had almost $11 million of intra-community exports, 22% more than in 2021. These are undeniable, very positive numbers, yes.
What about some of the challenges that are facing the Andean community? Do you think that the organization is facing challenges? If yes, what are they? Political, legal, economic, or others? And how might these be addressed?
Yeah, of course. Well, I would say to keep the interests of its member countries and, of course, the budget destined to this organization. Apart from that, I have been very critical of the Andean Parliament. I'm of the idea that it has to be restructured in order to allow them to issue not just recommendations, but binding pieces of legislation. Also, we need to allow only the candidacy of people not subject to investigations in their countries of origin, which is something that we are currently witnessing and which is quite recurrent because of the immunity that comes with the role of being a member of parliament.
Yeah, that's indeed something that I guess many scholars also wonder about. What is the purpose, really, of a parliament that cannot take any binding decisions?
Indeed.
And I guess in some ways, even in Europe, being a European originally, the European Parliament does have some power, but not to the extent that, it can be viewed as representative of the people, and sometimes perhaps it can block certain projects, but not necessarily push certain projects forward.
Yeah.
So I guess in some ways there are other regions that can think about the same problem as well.
Yeah.
Now, talking about the Andean community and the European Union, there are a lot of academics that have seen or written about the EU as a model that other regions can or should seek to emulate. Yeah. And I guess the Andean Parliament might in a way be an example of this. When having worked in the Andean community, does this really happen? Do you seek to borrow from Europe certain ideas and adapt them? And to what extent is this actually a viable practice in reality?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, yeah. And yeah, definitely we have borrowed many ideas and institutions from the European Union. Thanks to the Trujillo-Protocol in 1996, which shaped the Andean community as we know it today, we have now a commission, a court of justice, and a parliament, among other institutions. Even the procedures that the Andean Court of Justice deals with are in many ways the same that the EU Court of Justice currently has. This basically demonstrates that, yes, it is possible to borrow legal and institutional frameworks from one region and apply them successfully into another, such as the Andean Community.
Now, let's talk about another aspect of integration, which has to do with free movement. And we mentioned before the Andean passport as well. On one hand, it fosters economic growth. It leads to greater convenience, cultural inter-exchange between the countries, and so on. But on the other, it can also facilitate cross-border crime. Now, being a lawyer, I can't resist asking you, how can regional organizations like the Andean Community balance the benefits and drawbacks of free movement when it comes to security concerns? And are there legal mechanisms in place to do this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, no. I mean, in fact, in 2023, I wrote an article about the possibility of implementing judicial cooperation within the Andean Community in light of the Puigdemont case in Spain. As we know, judicial cooperation in criminal matters is an instrument regulated in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union and is based on the principle of mutual recognition of sentences and judicial resolutions of the 27 member countries. We don't have similar legislation within the Andean Community, and from my point of view, it is of the utmost importance to replicate the example of Council Framework Decision, I think is 2002-584, which regulates European arrest warrants. Unfortunately, even though there have been discussions about this, currently there is no legal instrument in place.
That's fascinating. The viewpoint that you seek to sort of purposefully, I guess, adopt some of the frameworks that exist in the EU.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something that's in slight contrast with some of the previous experts that have been on this podcast, which creates a very nice platform for debate between different viewpoints. But let's move on to other aspects of law as well. Now, you're an expert in trade law. What's your assessment of the Andean Community's trade integration efforts? What have been the biggest achievements and setbacks so far, and how do the trade policies of the Andean Community compare to those of other regions, especially since you've worked on the WTO and also global trade norms as well?
Yeah, well, as a preamble, well, there is something I would like to say. I mean, I think it is interesting to see that in Latin America, we have had more than 14 regional integration efforts, some of them unsuccessful, some others currently in place. As we know, we have the Central American Integration System, or CICA in Central America, the Caribbean Community in the Caribbean, UNASUR, the Latin American Integration Association, or ALADI, the Free Trade Latin American Association, or ALALC, MERCOSUR, CAN in Latin America, and the Pacific Alliance, among others. I mean, many integration efforts. But why is that? I mean, why so many different efforts and not just one as in the EU with its former European coal and steel community in the 50s as the basis, of course, of the European Union that we know nowadays? Even though there is perhaps not just one answer, the truth is that the Andean Community is one of the oldest regional integration blocs in our region. And as I said before, despite the withdrawal of Chile in the early 70s and later on of Venezuela, its achievements are undeniable. For some experts, CAN could be defined as an imperfect customs union. We have free movement of people and goods, and at some point we had a common external tariff, which was never applied. So the Andean Community is a sort of hybrid in the regional academic literature. It is hard to compare CAN's trade policies to those of other regional organizations, so I do not have a specific answer to your question.
It's true, yeah, that it's difficult to, I guess, give a final assessment of the economic integration efforts. But it's true that you're posing an important question. Why is there this alphabet soup of organizations that coexist and continue to coexist and continue to develop? If anything, I think we're seeing more of them rather than less over time.
Exactly, yes.
But let's then look at how these organizations interact with each other. So, for example, let's talk about CAN and MERCOSUR, which is, I guess, one of the most successful economic integration efforts here in Latin America. They've historically had an easy relationship, but recent discussions have revived interest in a stronger partnership between the two. What is the current state of CAN-MERCOSUR relations, and do you see realistic prospects for deepening trade and economic cooperation, or perhaps even a joint area of CAN and MERCOSUR becoming one huge trade area in Latin America?
Yeah, well, actually, from my point of view, CAN and MERCOSUR have had an uneasy relationship. What is the current status? As we know, we have the Economic Complementation Agreement number 48 between CAN and MERCOSUR, which established fixed preference margins for the creation of a free trade area between both integration blocs. Apart from that, we have also specific agreements, such as the Economic Complementation Agreement number 59, signed between Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay to create a free trade area, and the Economic Complementation Agreement number 58 between Peru and MERCOSUR. I guess that the main issue here is Bolivia, which is a CAN full member and which in 2024 finished its accession process to MERCOSUR thanks to Decision 598 that allowed CAN members to negotiate with third parties. Does this mean that other CAN members are going to follow suit? I don't think so. Does this mean that the CAN-MERCOSUR relationship is going to change soon? I don't think so either. I think that the Andean community is going to keep working independently from other organizations as it has done so far.
So I guess you're on the more pessimistic side when it comes to building greater convergences between Latin American trade blocs.
Yes.
Now, let's focus on MERCOSUR for a moment here as well. The bloc recently signed or finalized its free trade agreement negotiations with the European Union after 25 years of going through back and forth between the two sides. How has this news been perceived here in Latin America, especially as someone who's a trade lawyer? And what impact do you think it will have on regional integration efforts or maybe trans-regional integration efforts of some sort? Could this serve as a model for future negotiations between Latin America and other global economic blocs?
Yeah, well, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but the news of the signing of said agreement did not have any impact in Latin America, at least from my point of view. As mentioned before, South American countries are more concerned about their own internal agenda and not in the signing of trade agreements bloc to bloc. Having said that, in 2012, the trade agreement between Peru and the European Union was signed and entered into force the next year. Through this agreement, a free trade area was established between Peru and the member states of the European Union, where tariff preferences are granted to products that comply with some specific origin requisites. So, in a nutshell, the agreement between MERCOSUR with the EU is not important for us because we have our own free trade agreement with the EU. I don't know if this makes sense.
It does make sense indeed. Of course, we've seen various trade agreements here, both in terms of Latin American countries and I guess now blocs negotiating with other parts of the world. And also within Latin America, where we also see other blocs such as the Pacific Alliance as well, or I guess, ALBA, which I'm not sure to what extent is still functional, but I guess it still exists, at least on paper. As you mentioned, perhaps we won't see a big Latin American economic bloc of sorts, but what are then the main trends shaping Latin American trade integration today? And if we won't see a big economic bloc, will we see continued fragmentation then?
Yes, I think we will see continued fragmentation indeed. I don't see a scenario of greater convergence, to be honest. Just have a look at UNASUR and its demise. I mean, for those who don't know this, the Union of South American Nations, sometimes also referred to as the South American Union, UNASUR in Spanish, was a regional integration effort that comprised almost every South American country. Its constitutive treaty was signed in 2008, and after a few years, Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina, Uruguay, among others, renounced the treaty. We are countries with different ideologies, and in some cases with no democracy at all. I mean, and I'm talking here about Venezuela. We know what is happening in this country. We're aware of the change of paradigm in Argentina and its libertarianism, and the leftist governments in Chile and Brazil. What do I mean with this? That it is difficult to reconcile all these different ideologies into one steady project with one unifying common goal. I don't know if this makes sense.
Well, you do seem to have a very realistic point of view and very sort of, what would you call it, a point of view grounded in looking at the interests of Latin American countries when it comes to what the future of integration in the region might be. Now, let's look at Peru's role in Latin American integration or Latin American fragmentation, however you want to look at it. As a Peruvian scholar, how do you view Peru's role in regional integration efforts and blocs? Has it positioned itself as a bridge between regional blocs, or does it follow a more independent policy when it comes to trade or other issues? What is Peru's role?
Yeah. Well, definitely has a more independent trade policy. In fact, after years of economic prosperity, we are facing economic challenges that need to be addressed internally. Definitely, we don't have a protagonist role in regional integration, and to be honest, right now, with the way the government is handling key problems such as, the rise of criminality, the economic crisis, and even the processes we have lost before, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, among others, I don't see that this scenario is going to change, at least in the near future.
Now, let's also talk about domestic political shifts. So there is a lot of literature on the idea that domestic shifts in terms of change in governments, for example, and ideology and so forth, can affect regional integration, or at least the stance of a country when it comes to the extent to which or the way in which it engages with regional blocs. How have recent political developments in Peru and perhaps in other Latin American countries that you keep an eye on shaped their engagement with regional integration efforts? And are there any political trends, whether domestically in Peru or perhaps in some other countries, that we should be watching that you think really have an effect on these processes?
Yeah. I actually think that, well, from my point of view, of course, that we should watch Argentina. We all know that Javier Milei's views distinguish him within mainstream Argentine politics. He has been described as a right-wing populist and right-wing libertarian who supports laissez-faire economics. Does this represent a change in the more popular leftist trend that has characterized most of the South American governments? Hopefully, yes. Are we currently witnessing the search of a new paradigm? Perhaps, although it is too soon to draw conclusions. But regarding your other question, our recent political developments are not going to have any repercussions on integration efforts. Our government is, to be honest with you, is too weak to alter the current status quo and is currently on what we call surviving mode. In other words, the executive is not going to do anything that might trigger an altercation with Parliament. That is to say, it is not going to propose the withdrawal law, for example, the Andean Community or the Pacific Alliance, the CPTPP, and so on.
That makes sense, but there are other trends, I guess, or trajectories that I guess might affect the way that Latin American countries react. And of course, we can't escape the influence of the U.S. in the Latin American region as a whole. We've seen with the recent return of Trump to the White House a shift in U.S. foreign policy, which is now more assertive than before. We saw tariffs on Mexico and Canada, added tariffs. We saw the case of Colombia, where Trump effectively exerted his power to pressure Colombia to agree taking on planes with migrants, and in a very open way, which I think President Petro didn't appreciate, the way that he was put under pressure and put in the spotlight to respond to Trump's demands. How do you foresee the way in which Latin America engages with the U.S.? How are these policies that Trump is introducing perceived here, both, I guess, in Peru and in the region? And is this similar or different to the way that, I guess, the U.S. has influenced Latin American politics and integration historically?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say that the U.S. policy historically influenced Latin American regional integration efforts, at least in the late 60s. Let's have a look at the Latin American Free Trade Association, also known as ALALC in Spanish, and the Andean Community in the 60s, for example. The policy that actually governed most South American countries was import substitution, which in fact was not in line with the gradualism imposed by Nixon in the early 70s. More recently, however, it is not a secret that Venezuela opted out the Andean Community because of the free trade agreements that Colombia and Peru were negotiating at the time with the US. So, to answer your question, at certain points of our recent history, the US, yes, has influenced some of the regional integration processes in Latin America. Having said that, it is difficult to predict this scenario with Trump. We all know that President Trump unleashed a plan to impose so-called reciprocal tariffs on American trading partners. Briefly, the argument for reciprocal tariffs is, very straightforward. Whatever levies the American companies face in exporting their, goods to another country should apply to imports from that same country. In case this idea materializes, it is going to affect Latin American countries? Definitely. We must not forget that, at least in the case of Peru, we have a free trade agreement with the US, so we don't know whether Trump policies are going to affect, the accord. Yeah.
That's, I guess, quite a nuanced take, which I guess acknowledges the way that the Latin American countries have to respond to the U.S., but at the same time, it does, I guess, rightly point out that regional integration is a separate process from U.S. influence in many ways. Now, speaking of great powers, we've talked about the U.S., but now there is also the greater involvement of China in Latin America. We recently saw the opening of a massive port here in Peru that was financed by China. How do you view China's influence on Latin American regional integration, or perhaps in other aspects? Do you think it's becoming a more influential player than the U.S., perhaps in economic terms at least?
Yeah, well, with the unpredictable scenario that is currently unfolding with Trump, probably China is going to have a more protagonist role in Latin American economy. Recently I came across an article of the Council of Foreign Relations, and just to give you some numbers. In 2000, the Chinese market accounted for less than 2% of Latin America's exports, but China's rapid growth and resulting demand drove the region's subsequent commodities boom. Over the next 8 years, trade grew at an average annual rate of 31%. And by 2021, trade exceeded a record of 450 billion US dollars, according to the Chinese government. And some economists predict that it could exceed $700 billion dollars by 2035, yes. China currently ranks as South America's top trading partner and the second largest for Latin America as a whole, after the United States. With the potential tariffs due to be imposed to Mexico, we don't know whether China is going to take an even more prominent role in Latin American trade. However, I don't think that this is going to modify the influence on regional integration in Latin America. Right now, to be perfectly honest, I think that Latin American countries are more concerned about their own problems, their own internal problems, rather than regional integration. Yeah.
That's I guess a real change in the trade dynamics of the region, with China rising to the top spot as being the number one trading partner for South America. Now, with the rise of China, we've also seen the rise of the BRICS. We've also seen a greater push for multipolarity and a push for reform in international institutions and the way that they, I guess, govern the order of international politics. As a part of this a trend, we've seen also a response from the U.S., where the U.S. has started to, in some ways, disregard the decisions of international organizations on certain matters. And we saw even the withdrawal of the U.S. from the WHO at one point, and other moves that, I guess, isolated more from the international organizations. Now, we also have the WTO that you've worked on extensively. Its influence has declined in recent years, and we've seen a lot of trade blocs that are emerging regionally. What do you think of the WTO's role? Do you think it's changing? Do you think it has an impact on particularly Latin American countries? And are other global institutions going to perhaps step in and somehow displace or replace the WTO and its role?
Yeah. Interesting question. Well, we all know that the WTO is facing a deep crisis, especially with regards to its dispute settlement system. And with Trump, the scenario is unlikely to change. In 2019, he blocked the appointment of new members of the appellate body. And there are no reasons to believe that he's going to change his stance. In other words, the WTO is going to keep functioning without a second instance, which means that Latin American countries are looking at, other ways to resolve their differences. Some authors have emphasized the possibility of resorting to other regional forums, such as, for example, the Pacific Alliance, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, also known as the CPTPP, instead of the multilateral jurisdiction of the WTO to resolve a dispute. However, well, of course, the potential outcome of this is yet to be seen. Yeah.
So it seems like we might be in for a transformation of some sort, in which we might see, I guess, a greater role for some regional orders of sort. Now, there has been a rise in the prominence of regional courts, including the Andean Tribunal of Justice, and also in Asia we have a number of international commercial courts that have been established and that are, I guess, of course, not nearly as prominent as the European Court of Justice, but still rising in terms of their role. Are we witnessing the regionalization of international legal order, perhaps in a way of the global spread of certain norms, but the regional implementation or the regional distribution of power in the way that these norms are applied? And if yes, how significant is this trend? Or if no, then what are we seeing?
Well, I wouldn't say that we are witnessing the, sort of regionalization of the international legal order. Countries engage in trade relations with members of a regional bloc, but also with other countries. Undeniably, in case of a trade dispute with the latter, regional courts do not have jurisdiction, so countries have to resort to other ways to resolve their disputes. In Latin America, for example, the ICSID, the International Center for, the center that we talked about early on, the ICSID jurisdiction is quite popular here in Latin America. We talk about the crisis of the WTO dispute settlement body. And because of this, member countries decided to set up pursuant to Article 25 of the WTO dispute settlement understanding, the so-called multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement, which was established in 2020 with only 16 members and which has now 27 members, including Peru. Thanks to this mechanism, several disputes have been resolved, such, for example, pharmaceutical products with Turkey and anti-dumping duties on frozen fries with Colombia. So, yes, there are ways, to resolve these disputes apart from the traditional ones. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, yeah, and it seems like, I guess, a very sort of problem-focused way of looking at ways to use the system to address specific issues, rather than, I guess, looking at it from a more political perspective or from a perspective of balance of power and shifts in the order more broadly. Now, as we move towards the end of our conversation, I ask all of my guests for some recommendations on the Latin American literature of politics, trade law, integration. The literature is in different languages, Spanish, Portuguese, and English, of course, and it's quite difficult to navigate. If you were asked, let's say, by a colleague or, let's say, a graduate student for some recommendations in terms of essential resources, these could be books, papers, films, series, podcasts, experts, media channels, whatever you feel is most important in this regard. What would your recommendations be? What are the crucial resources that you would recommend to somebody for understanding, I guess, these issues in Latin America?
Yeah. Well, a book that I always recommend in Spanish and related to the Andean community is, sorry, I'm going to say it in Spanish. It's called Instituciones y Derecho de la Comunidad Andina by Jorge Antonio Quindimil, professor at Universidad A Coruña, published in 2006. For me, it is the best book about the Andean community. I remember reading it when I joined the organization back in 2010. Having said that, and to be perfectly honest with you right now, my area of research is focused mostly on WTO law. So I'm not really aware right now of the latest developments in regional integration in Latin America, at least with regards to books or podcasts. VLEX, for example, is a good database that might give you some interesting resources, and of course the information that you can find in the web pages of these institutions themselves.
Yeah, well, these still seem like resources that could be quite useful, and I guess it's not always the newest resources that might be the best in some ways. Now, let me finish up by asking you about your upcoming projects. If some of the members of our audience are interested in following you, what should they expect from you? What are you currently working on in terms of publications and projects and upcoming developments?
Yeah. Well, last year I published a book. It's called Introduction to Law, focused, of course, on the civil law system, the one that we have here in Latin America. This year I have plans to publish a paper focused on the crisis of the WTO, and in particular of its understanding on rules and procedures governing the settlement of disputes, and hopefully in 2026 a more ambitious project, a book on international trade in Spanish for, well, basically for my students, yeah.
Well, we're looking forward to the outcomes of these interesting projects. Well, it's been a pleasure to host you today, Humberto, and your insights have been a treasure trove for anybody that looks to understand, I guess, trades, law in Latin America, as well as other relevant issues. I hope to speak to you soon, and thanks very much for joining me on this podcast.
Thank you very much, Ivo. A pleasure.